All right, my English teacher friends. So in this writing workshop video, I'm going to talk about a particular alternative grading method that I've developed over the years. And I started these alternative grading methods because early in my career, I kind of saw the futility of the traditional grading paradigm. If we really think about it, 99.9% of the onus is placed on the teacher's shoulders. Apart from reading the comments that we manage to squeeze into the margins of student essays, above and beyond that, what are we really tasking them to do? And we know that a lot of them don't even read our comments. They look at the grade and they're like, yeah, I love Mr. Kuhn. He gave me a 98. Or they're like, Mr. Kuhn's a jerk. He gave me a 72. It's as if we're doing to them. And it seems very arbitrary and rather pie in the sky and ethereal in terms of where these grades are coming from. So I like to have a more deliberate manner in which that onus is at least a 50-50 split. I like to have students doing more than me. I worked with Ted Sizer in graduate school, and he always said that if teachers are doing more than students, then learning is compromised. It leads to enablement and learned helplessness. And I think the traditional grading paradigm has done that to some extent. So this is just one of many, many, many alternative grading methods that I use. And during this writing workshop, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of my templates, because you need templates in order to use these alternative grading methods, whether they be my templates or someone else's. It's really pivotal that your students have a shared language with you, so that you're talking about the same apples and oranges. So let's dive right into this. So this one I call the beach rally. And this slide that you're looking at here is the actual PowerPoint slide that I use in order to do this particular alternative grading method. So if you go into Google or Yahoo and just type in the Beach Rally PowerPoint, you can download it for free. I don't own the rights to it, and I just kind of adapt it for the purposes of this instructional activity. So again, it's called the Beach Rally, and it's free in Google or Yahoo if you just do a quick internet search of it. So here's the thing with grading that often gets overlooked. I think that when you introduce the elements of collaboration and competition into learning, learning really sticks. It's a whole other layer of Velcro that we really don't take advantage of. So if you're familiar with my work, you know that for my discussion modalities, I invented something called Plato's Plato discussion, which takes the good elements, the effective elements of the Harkness discussion, the fishbowl, and the Socratic seminar, and you gamify it. You have a competitive, collaborative nature to it. And I like to do the same every now and then with my alternative grading methods, and I'll get into that in just a second. So here are the setup and rules, the guidelines for this beach rally alternative grading method. So as I already alluded to, it's essential that you have a common language. So templates are a must. So I'll be talking in terms of declarative inverted theses. I'll be talking all the stuff that I talk about with my Nuance Academy in terms of sentence constructs, voice, rhythm, flow. My students know the parts of speech. We'll be talking about first premises, second premises, conclusion, the 5-word rule for embedded quotes, all that stuff that I'm always jibber-jabbering about in my writing workshops. I'll be talking about in the alternative grading methods, because students know what I'm speaking about. And if you're assigning writing instead of explicitly teaching it, like if you're not Bob Rossing your instruction with templates, you really don't have a foundation upon which to talk to your students. So for this, and I'll show you the PowerPoint slide in a second, there's 5 beach cars that race against each other. So I asked for 5 anonymous volunteers to submit their papers. And I usually just ask my students this: who thinks they wrote a killer essay? And I always have at least 5 kids in the class that say, oh, I nailed this one. And they want to compete against each other, and it's very cool. So oftentimes I'll enter my paper into the race. So I'll Bob Ross a model, and I might I might write that or paint that essay to perfection and crank it like PhD level, because you got to keep in mind Bob Ross never dumbed it down. And sometimes it's really good for us not to dumb it down either. Sometimes I'll put inherent flaws in it, kind of anticipate the snafus and the pitfalls that students are going to run into. And I'll have those really manifest in my writing just to highlight them during the writing workshop. So as we're going through the writing workshop, we proceed through each criteria of the rubric. So we'll take a look at all 5 examples and models that the students submit. And we might be looking at introductions first, and we'll look at voice, rhythm, flow, to be verbs, tier 2 level vocabulary, whether the kid inverted, declared, which is better. We'll see if starting with a hook or an analogy is better than just taking a dry academic approach. We'll take a look at the tier 2, the colloquial, the vernacular, everything, every little wrinkle, every little facet we'll unpack. And then the kicker is that students self-appraise while we're going. So I'll say, all right, we took a look at 5 examples, 5 models. In the margin of your paper, tell us what's going on with your introduction in like 3 to 5 sentences. Where do you stack in comparison to the 5 that you've seen? Talk about the good, the bad, the ugly with regards to what you're seeing in your own writing. Another thing that I do prior to the activity, prior to the alternative grading method, is I'll pre-read all the essays. So students submit them to me prior to the workshop. And on a notepad, I'll write down the grade I think the student deserved. So let's say I'm reading Jason's and I'm like 82, Samantha 94, Peter 100, etc. I just write down the grade. I don't make any comments on their papers at all. I just write down the grade. At the end of this exercise, students are going to have a whole bunch of notes in their margin. They are starting a dialogue with me, but they're the ones conversing. And in traditional grading paradigm, you think about it, we're the only ones talking. Our students don't even get a chance most of the time to respond and reflect to our comments, right? And that's typical. So in this, students are beginning the conversation, and they're going to say a lot about their writing in terms of comparing and contrasting their writing to the 5 samples that are in Google Classroom, or I project them onto the overhead. So that's the thing. That's the kicker. The more writing that students see, the better off they're going to be. And especially the more good writing that they see, the better off they're going to be. I call it the covetous affair. In the traditional grading paradigm, students typically don't see each other's work. It's as if the teacher huddles around it and they're like, it's my writing now. You can't see it. You can't see it. And with alternative grading methods, students see so much writing that they're able to really piece together a good comprehensive sense of what's good writing, what's bad writing, and what's ugly writing, right? So through this process, the more writing they see, the better they're going to be. Think about in terms of Bob Ross, right? The more times you do it, the more times you see him execute at the easel and canvas, the better the painter you're going to become. So one thing I like to do during this writing workshop as well is something that I call Think Pair Square. I'll put the students' desk in groups of 4, and there's something that I call the mirror effect. Sometimes when students are looking at their own writing, it's like looking at themselves too closely in the mirror. So what I'll do is have students pass their computers or their papers around the square to get some peer feedback as they're comparing their writing to the 5 samples that have been submitted into the contest, into the beach rally contest. So this is what the PowerPoint looks like. Each essay is assigned a color, and it's anonymous. So there's a yellow essay, a blue essay, orange, red, and green essay. We don't know the student's name. We don't know if it's my essay, Peter, Samantha's, Todd's, Wyatt's. It doesn't matter. So it's all anonymous so that we don't get into popularity contest. And as we go through the essay, we just, as I said earlier, go through each part of the rubric. And I'll give you some examples of this. But first, let me preface this. If you like what you're seeing here, note that I am offering a 2-hour intensive on November 12th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time with the National Writing Project. We're going to go over 25 of these alternative grading methods. So my favorite, most effective 25. And for those of you needing professional development hours, know that the National Writing Project will assign a 2-hour completion badge. And we're also bundling this with my self-paced course, which gives you an extra 10 hours of professional development if you want to go that route. So again, November 12th, we're going to be live in Zoom, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you like what you see, come join us. So in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to show you a very complicated essay that I did with my AP language students. It's the Psychology of Teenage Dating synthesis paper, in which we used MTV's parental control. So here's the prompt. Given that you now know a bit of the psychology and sociology behind the scenes of teenage dating, here's what you need to do. Give dating advice in the form of a letter to one of the principal characters from MTV's Parental Control. Position yourself as a therapist, a counselor, or a BFF. Give your subject an inside look into the clockwork of their inner psyches and get them on the right path. Draw evidence from at least 3 sources. So this became a really interesting exercise in voice in terms of how do you manipulate the colloquial, the vernacular, and the academic. Clearly, if you position yourself as a therapist, you're going to speak differently than a BFF, right? So a therapist and counselor has a more academic, professional tone to it. BFF is going to be a little bit more casual. So we'll take a glance at that. So the setup for this is students had to watch any 2 episodes they wanted of MTV's Parental Control. There's plenty of free ones on YouTube. We participated in the Plato's Plato discussion where we broke down the articles together. The source material that I gathered for them gets into some really interesting stuff like Erik Erikson, Freud, all the big Piaget, all the big guns in terms of teenage dating and the psychology behind teenage dating and some of the sociology behind it as well. And they read and annotated the source packet and completed the quote tracker so that they had all their textual support in Bay. So the question is this: how do I write the introduction? And you can declare or invert the thesis. So let me show you exactly what I mean by this. So when you declare, you can begin with the thesis. Just answer the essential question out of the gate. Just boom, drop it, right? From there, you got to provide a little bit of context and background. I do like to see a fair amount of tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is just your average run-of-the-mill SAT level words, and then maybe a little bit of colloquial and vernacular depending on how you position yourself in this. And again, those that are familiar with my work, you know that I run the Word Study Academy as well as the Nuance Academy because I'm really concerned with voice, rhythm, and flow. My students have a good knack for manipulating the 12 sentence constructs that Strunk and White espouse in their seminal text called Write It Right. So you'll see my students manipulating their syntax, hopefully to achieve that sophistication point in terms of getting the voice, the rhythm, and the flow. And then since we're using templates, it's always going to be 4 sentences long. So note, right? If we're talking in language like this in terms of a template, we have a common discourse now, a common thread to evaluate in our writing workshop the language of a declarative thesis. If we invert, you end with the thesis, you end with your point. So you might start with a hook, an analogy. As you funnel down, boom, drop the thesis, 4th sentence, same stuff. Tier 2 sentence constructs for the voice, the rhythm, and flow, exactly 4 sentences. So let's take a look at this for a second, and I'll have you take a peek at something. So one of the things that I often do is I'll just color code the essays. As you can see here, put the green paper in Google Docs. I'll put the red paper or not in Google Docs, in Google Classroom, and we'll proceed that way. But oftentimes, for the sake of demonstration, I'll just put them in Canvas slides and go through them that way. So let's take a look at this. We know that students need to write a letter, and they have to position themselves as a therapist, a counselor, or a BFF. So I'll demonstrate this for you real quickly and talk about how we would proceed through the beach rally alternative grading method. So we would just look at all 5 introductions, take a look at every aspect of the rubric. So let's just take a look at this first one. Dear Anthony, teenage dating is a bit like the phenomena of being presented with a massive menu at a fancy restaurant. Most people would select a dish that they are familiar with instead of going out on a limb to try something new. An unconscious mental model of attachment is at play here. And believe it or not, the same type of consideration comes into play when we choose our significant others. Whether we grew up with ideal parents like June and Ward Cleaver, or within the walls of sheer dysfunction, we tend to date what we know. Given this, I'd choose a partner who's very different in every aspect of life from your mother. So the advice comes down here, right? That's the prompt. You have to give advice to one of the principal characters. This student chose Anthony, and the advice comes here, the thesis. So it's an inverted thesis. I'd choose a partner who's very different in every aspect of life from your mother. So during the writing workshop, I want to do as little talking as possible. I want my students to kind of break this down together. So let's take a look here. They begin by way of hook or analogy. And not all students did this in their introductions. And this one is actually very good. It's very cool. This idea of looking at a massive menu, it's analogous to teenage dating, but we tend to choose partners that mirror and reflect our parents. This Oedipal Electra kind of thing going on. We read some articles about that, and we tend to kind of velcro ourselves to the dysfunction of our family units in our couples, our adult couplings. So this is very dynamic. Look at the sentence structure. So the complexity of this first sentence, complexity to the second sentence, there's no parallelism at all. Like typically in composition, you don't want to be paralleling independent clause upon independent clause upon independent clause, which is what our struggling and emerging writers do. So usually you don't do that in an introduction. So there's good voice rhythm flow. Check out the tier 2 in this, right? Great words, phenomena, unconscious mental model, attachment, right? So dysfunction. So you don't overdo the vocab. Great analogy to June and Ward Cleaver. That's really cool that a student knows that type of stuff to bring into this. So very cool start out of the gates blazing. So this is definitely a contender for first place. Here's another one. Dear Jimmy, it is very common for some teenagers to experience the opossum effect when it comes to their early dating years. In this stage of development, teens have very passive identities and are more or less people pleasers and seldom assert their wills. Teens that get stuck in the state of moratorium usually become doormats in relationships unless they couple with a like-minded individual. With this in mind, I highly suggest you date Katrina, given her temperament and inclinations. So again, this one's really, really good. But how does it compare to number 1? So what separates number 2 from number 1 and vice versa? What's going on different? So one of the main differences I see is that this just starts with an academic intro, right? Gets anchored right into the theory of some of the psychology and sociology that was in the source packet. There's no hook, there's no analogy. So with my students, we're going to have a conversation. Is it best to start with a hook or an analogy? Is it more colorful? Is it more effective? Is it more technical? Is it more nuanced? The vocab in this one seems to be a little higher than the other one, than the first one. The sentence constructs don't seem to be as advanced. So which one do we like better, 1 or 2? And again, we just have a whole class discussion. And then when we get to, the end of our looking at our 5th one, we're going to rank them and just move the cars forward, right? So which car has the best one? Which one comes first, second, third, fourth, and fifth? And then based on the introductions, students can reflect and kind of appraise where they're at with regards to the five. Which one do they look like? Student might say, mine's most like the blue car because, my syntax isn't developed, and, I declared the thesis, and through the process of this, we discovered that the inverted theses were more sophisticated. When I revise, I'm going to try to do the hook or the analogy. I really need to up my vocab. I have some punctuation errors, etc. So I'll show you one more here. Good morning, Lisa. Most parents deem parallel play to be an important facet in the development of their young child, hence all the play dates in early childhood. As to no surprise, some kids do better in these social situations than others, and believe it or not, these tendencies follow individuals well into their teen and adult years. For some, this is simply a crisis of intimacy versus isolation. Given how egocentric and narcissistic you are, I strongly advise you not to date until you come to terms with these personal issues. Great advice from a therapist, a counselor, or a BFF. Really good. But again, how does this stack to 1, 2, and 3? So clearly the kids that entered this competition all have some serious writing chops, and that's the glory of this, right? Your other students in the peanut gallery get to see some excellent writing, and they just sponge it through osmosis. They begin to see, my writing's not stacking up to this. What can I do? It's a much more effective way than us just hovering over their papers, playing red ink hawk, doing all the commentary and all the kind of monologuing that we tend to do in those margins. It's not really that effective. So I have other intros here, but for time's sake, I'll skip on. And let's talk about the body paragraphs. Again, we discussed the need for templates, that students need a uniform language, and that's what we do in the body paragraphs. And again, those that are familiar with my work, that body paragraphs across the expository mode. So whether a kid's doing rhetorical analysis, literary analysis, argument persuasion, synthesis, and even research, my kids always use the syllogistic method. And I'm not going to do a deep dive into it now. I'm just showing an alternative grading method. But in terms of constructing it for synthesis, the first premise is going to be an argument containing a why reason. The second premise is going to be the textual support, and the conclusion is going to be the links and echoes to the thesis. A syllogistic body paragraph, students are shooting for 10 sentences, hard cap at 12, unless they have a reason to go over, but I really don't like them going over. They tend to blow V8 and break their line of reasoning. So in the body paragraphs, we talk about specific things, like the first premise should be 3 sentences long to keep the centrality of the argument. So they have to talk about the why reason, because in the thesis you're just answering the prompt, kind of you're giving advice, and that's it, right? You don't get into the reasons, you don't get into the specifics. You save that for the body paragraph. So let's take a look at student number 1 here. When a teenager is caught in a state of liminality, it stands to reason that their romantic relationships are headed down a rocky road. With an identity split at the crossroads of being half child and half adult, clearly the adolescent is not fully prepared emotionally to navigate their way through the demands of sustaining a healthy relationship. And again, with me, and again, if you're familiar with my work, you know that with the first premise, I always pause after the third sentence and say, what are you promising your reader? What's the promise of the first premise? Well, clearly we got to talk about liminality. We got to talk about that purgatory split, and then the ability to navigate your way between that adult-child relationship, that purgatory sense in the teen years. All right, so let's compare this to the first premise of student number 2. The concept of magnetism often finds itself creeping into our relationships unbeknownst to most of us. Within this psychological phenomena, one person in the couple seeks the kitten licks they did not receive from one or both of their parents in childhood. As such, a man may be looking for mother love in a romantic partnership and vice versa. Such a dynamic could clearly thwart the formation of a healthy union, right? And again, what are we talking about here? What are we promising? So we're going to talk about this kitten licks, this idea of magnetism, that we're drawn to our parents, and the emotional emptiness, that emotional vacuum that they didn't fill. We go to partners and we expect our partner to be the mother we didn't have or the father that we didn't have. So we would compare the 5 first premises to each other and talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, what separates them. And then we'd go back to the beach rally and move the car that wins the first premise, right? We do this for every criteria in the body paragraph. So quote transitions, sustained line of reasoning, vocab, sentence structures, every little kit and caboodle of the rubric we go through. So I won't go through the whole essay. We'd be here forever if we were to do that. But just to note, you can get through a whole class stack of essays of students appraising their own essays in about 60 minutes. So for full confession's sake, I run on a block schedule. We have 86-minute blocks. We see each other every other day. And I can get a whole class done in 80 minutes. It usually takes us about 60 minutes, depending on whether or not we get layweight or digress at all during our conversation. And that added element of competition and collaboration is really nice, because at the end, what we'll do is we'll say, all right, blue wins, that's 100. Red comes in second, it's like a 92, 93. And orange comes in third, it's looking like high 80s. And purple is coming in fourth, we're looking low 80s. And green came in last. That's kind of what like a high 70 paper would look like. So students get a wide spectrum of grades typically when we do this. And then when at the end of the exercise, when I say, what grade do you think you deserve and why, they have a good concrete sense of where they stand. And as I said earlier, if we're within a 5-point margin of error, I'll give them the higher grade. So if a student says, I deserve an 88, and they give me like 5 sentences explaining why they deserve an 88, and I said 92, we're within 5 points, and I'll give them the 92. So if you're interested in the alternative grading methods 2-hour intensive, I encourage you to check out my website at teachinghowtowrite.com. And there's plenty of information on my website there and links to NWP's page to enroll. Again, it's a 2-hour completion badge for those needing professional development. We're also bundling it with my my Teach It Right self-paced course, which is a 10-hour completion badge. It's pretty cool course. It takes all the elements of my live Teach It Right mastermind, plus a whole bunch of other stuff in there. And if you have questions, feel free to give me a ring at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. So I hope all is well. Happy teaching, happy writing, and happy grading.